What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The topic of this episode is the gray areas. We're going to be considering a few common scenarios in poker, the ethics of which are somewhat unclear, hence gray area, and as a result, often leaves the end user or average player with quite a number of questions that often aren't explicitly answered. At least this is not really a conversation that I see takes place online very frequently. We're going to consider these areas now. Now, anytime we're dealing with a gray area, opinions are going to be involved. I'm going to be giving you my opinion on areas, the ethics of which are unclear. You may have your own personal opinions. That's completely fine. You're entitled to your own opinions on these areas. One common theme that we'll see in all of these areas is this question: should poker rooms make rules that they cannot enforce? Again, it's up to you to provide your opinion on that. I'm leaning towards poker rooms should not make rules unless they can enforce those rules. And the reason is that when a poker room makes a rule that it can't enforce, it creates an imbalance on their poker network. Because on the one hand, you have law-abiding poker players who choose to abide by that rule. Whereas on the other hand, you have angle shooters, poker players who are willing to take any edge. And if it's too easy to violate a certain rule, we now have a gap. We now have an unfair advantage for the players who are willing to break rules, assuming those rules are very easy to break. It seems to me that it would be better that the rule didn't exist in that specific situation because it helps to level the playing field. Whereas if a poker room is actually able to enforce a certain ruling and it's very, very difficult to bypass that particular rule, then I would say that that's fair enough. You'll see how this applies as we get into our gray areas. So the first particular gray area we'll discuss is data mining. So if you're not familiar with data mining, it's the idea of purchasing a very large amount of hand histories, usually in the millions or tens of millions. And the point of purchasing those hands is to run population analysis to get player pool trends. But not just that, also data mines are commonly used at the poker tables to get data on specific opponents. So the idea is I could go and purchase 10 million hands right now, sit down at my regular game, and one of the opponents that pops up on my table, perhaps I've never seen him before, but because of my hand history purchase, I now have 50k hands on that particular opponent. I know how much he c-bets, how much he folds to raises, how much he 3-bets pre-flop, whereas he doesn't know me, he's never seen me before. Now, as you can imagine, if I know how to use that data well, that's going to give me a competitive advantage against that particular player. He doesn't know me, but I know him. Now, up until recently, data mining was not explicitly covered by the terms and conditions of most poker rooms. In other words, it wasn't illegal, but there were reports online of players getting into trouble and in some cases even having their accounts banned for broadcasting the fact that they were making use of data mines. Since then, it has become part of some poker rooms' terms and conditions. So when we talk about gray areas, it could be the case that some rooms explicitly prohibit a certain activity, but other rooms don't. So we get this general gray area of poker players not really being sure whether this is an okay activity or not. Now, in terms of the ethics of data mining, on face value, it does seem pretty unethical, right? Why should I have 50k hands on my opponent when he has 0k hands on me? The problem we run into here is the lack of enforceability of the prohibition on data mining. As of now, there's no decent way of detecting whether a player is making use of data mined information. The players who got into trouble in the past, it's because they were broadcasting the fact that they were data mining, perhaps over a YouTube video or a live stream, and clearly making their screen name available in the process. In terms of the regular player who keeps fairly quiet about what they're doing, there's no way of detecting whether they're making use of data mined information. The problem is, if you ban data mining, players are still going to continue doing it because there's no way of it being detected. So all of a sudden you have this gap, the gap we described earlier, where you have good, law-abiding players now at a disadvantage simply because they're following the rules, they don't make use of data mined hand histories, but a decent chunk of their opponents are making use of data mines because there's nothing in place to stop them doing so. So the poker room has now created this imbalance. Now there's two ways of approaching this. Poker rooms could try and find ways to enforce not using data mines. Sounds fairly difficult to me. I'm not sure how you'd prove that. The other very straightforward option is simply not to prohibit use of data mined hand histories. We've completely leveled the playing field without any need for complex countermeasures to try and prevent players from making use of data mines. Besides, one of the reasons why this is a gray area is because we have to think about context here as well. It's one thing to have 50k hands on an unknown opponent, but what if we're just using that data mined information to draw conclusions about the player pool in general? Interestingly, some poker rooms have actually prohibited this activity as well. It's not just prohibited to use data mines at the table, but to use that information off the table in order to draw conclusions about the player pool. Again, how would that ever be detected? I might not even be a player at that particular room. I could, for example, take a data mine for a site that I never play at, look at that data, not with any intention of playing on that network, just to draw conclusions about how poker players behave in general while at the table. Not only could the poker room never enforce that, but it seems very unlikely that they would legally be allowed to do anything regarding that particular type of activity. Because after all, if I'm using data mines for a site that I don't even play on, then I've never even agreed to that room's terms and conditions. This is, for all intents and purposes, just data floating around in the wild. Now, of course, there could be some counter argument to this, which is ultimately the poker room owns the data, the hand history data, and hence it's not okay for me to be using that data for a purpose that they've specified is not okay. But the main point is we'd probably agree that the ethics of this really depend on the context. It's very different using data mines for broad pool analysis compared to using that data to target a specific opponent. Or perhaps you don't feel that way, perhaps you think it's just the same or just as bad. You're entitled to your opinion on this. My viewpoint is certainly that the ethics may change depending on the context here. But I also think that data mining is something that has to stay just because it levels the playing field. There's no way to enforce this, so in order not to confer a disadvantage on certain groups of players, it's necessary to allow data mining for all players. Again, just my opinion. Don't get upset if you have a completely different opinion. That's fine. That's why this is a gray area, right? There's not necessarily a large consensus on what is right or wrong here. And interestingly, in the past, many of these allegations regarding the ethics of data mining, why should you have 50k hands on villain when he has nothing of you? Many of these same things have been said about usage of HUDs in the past. And I don't think there are really too many poker players that claim that using HUDs is unethical. But if you go far enough back in online poker history, there was a time when there was a big question mark over the usage of HUDs. Similar to the data mining example, imagine a situation where I have HUD stats on you, but you don't have HUD stats on me. So I basically have computer assistance in gathering data on you, whereas you don't have that same advantage when playing against me. So overall, I have the advantage here because I'm playing against you with computer assistance. Now, we're probably familiar with the idea that certain poker rooms have banned HUDs, and we might assume it's to do with protecting players. And although that's indirectly true, the main reason that some poker rooms ban HUDs is to do with preserving the poker ecology. It's a little bit more self-centered than we might like to imagine. It's mostly about preserving profits for the poker room. It's not so much about protecting you from being exploited by an advanced opponent who has HUD stats on you, at least not directly. It's more a case of if you lose your chips too fast, that can be damaging for the poker ecology. But it's also not as if the poker room is going to feel bad if you ultimately lose all of your chips. They don't care about that. So what do we think? Are HUDs unethical? And I think most poker players would say no. You can kind of see why some players might think it's unethical because we have stats on our opponent. It's really only unethical if it's one-sided, i.e. one player has the ability to have a HUD, but his opponent doesn't have the ability to have a HUD. But so long as everyone has the ability to run a HUD if they want one, then it levels the playing field. The problem with banning HUDs is once again difficulty with enforceability. Now, most countermeasures against using HUDs are fairly effective, and that really plays on the level of technical ability that the average poker player has. If we think about the average HUD that's running online, it's going to be a HUD that ships with Poker Tracker, Holder Manager, Hand to Note, Drive HUD, whichever HUD you use. Those HUDs typically cooperate with the poker room themselves. The poker rooms are aware of the various signatures that indicate that that particular HUD is running. They're able to detect if those HUDs are running, but in most cases, those HUDs just won't work out of the box with the tracker because it's been disabled to work on that particular room. How do you circumvent that? It's by creating a custom HUD or making customizations to a legitimate commercially available HUD. Making it so the poker room doesn't detect that you have that HUD running. Now, obviously, this requires a higher degree of technical know-how, but we don't want to be naive and imagine that no one out there has the ability to create a HUD that runs on a poker room that doesn't allow HUDs. And once again, we find ourselves in a situation where the nefarious actors now gain an even larger advantage because they're now operating a HUD in an environment where no other player has a HUD. So generally, having a HUD is an advantage because not every player in a certain network is going to be using a HUD. Now imagine you're playing in a certain network and 99% of the players in that network don't have a HUD because the HUD is not allowed on that network. Suddenly your HUD is conferring a much larger advantage than it would in a typical poker environment. We also have to factor in how well poker rooms do with actually enforcing this law. They've given themselves the responsibility of making sure that players aren't running HUDs. Depending on the quality of the site security team, they may do a good or a bad job of this. I'd like to give you one example from experience. So this was during a time when 888 Poker decided to ban HUDs on their fast format offering, which is called Snap Poker, by the way. And we found that Poker Tracker and Holder Manager immediately rolled out updates where the HUD just simply wouldn't load on 888 Poker. And Hand to Note did the same as well, but Hand to Note interface also has a system that allows you to easily roll back to previous versions of Hand to Note. And what we found is that it was very, very easy without any technical knowledge to roll back to a previous version of Hand to Note and have the HUD running at Snap Poker at 888. Now, this is not to say that this was necessarily used by myself, but there must have been a decent number of players who figured out that you could simply roll back the tracker and have a fully working HUD, and 888 did absolutely nothing about this, by the way, or simply just be a player who didn't update your HUD to the latest version, didn't update Hand to Note, and you have a HUD running, as usual, you don't even realize you now have this huge advantage. Everyone else's HUD has been turned off automatically by their tracker, but you're running an old version of Hand to Note, you don't know about the update button, or at least can't be bothered to update regularly, and now as a result, you're one of the 10% of players who has access to our HUD in an environment where 90% of players have a rule enforced on them where their HUD has been disabled. As you can imagine, this type of very unbalanced setup never really made the news anywhere, was never really in any articles, in any reports or anything like that. It was just kind of ignored, brushed over. And of course, every poker room has slips. When we're dealing with something complex like technology, there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be bugs, we all expect that. But this was a situation that persisted for well over 6 months, where you could just step into an environment, have a fully working HUD with no repercussions, even though using that HUD was technically against the rules of the site. So it's not to say that banning HUDs is unenforceable. It is enforceable to a certain extent, but there are ways to circumvent that ruling. And it could be the case that even if it is enforceable, it might not be being enforced properly depending on the quality of the security team. Again, you might say the easiest solution, the easiest way to level the playing field here is just allow everyone to have access to HUDs. That way you know no one is getting a huge unfair advantage by running a HUD because everyone has this option available to them. Now, we do see other ways to increase the security of trying to enforce this particular rule where we say no HUDs. For example, we see rooms with anonymized hand histories, and we see rooms with completely removed hand histories. For example, if you take GG Poker, you can download your hand histories 24 hours after a session, I think it is. Those hand histories won't be tied to a specific player. There will be a key or a number in place of the player's name, and that won't necessarily be consistent from hand history to hand history. It might be consistent over the course of a session. I don't know. I haven't looked at it in detail. A fairly secure way of doing things, but again, we'd be naive if we assumed that there was absolutely no way of working around this. There was no countermeasure where we couldn't somehow link up a player's key or ID with their username and generate data on that specific opponent over a larger sample. It's possible to get HUDs running at GG. Of course, this is against the terms and conditions, and it's probably a fairly dangerous thing to do because they do actively ban players they think are making use of HUDs. So definitely wouldn't recommend breaking any site terms and conditions, despite this conversation on gray areas. But is it possible? Yes, it's possible. Are there players doing it? I think it would be naive to think that no one has tried to get a decent HUD running at GG or any other poker room that doesn't allow HUDs. Even if you completely remove hand histories from a room, it's possible to use screen scraping techniques to store data on our opponents at the table. So nothing completely solves the problem. Having said this, if it becomes very difficult to circumvent, if only a very small percentage of players are able to circumvent a certain ruling, I would say that's at least okay. That's at least allowable. The problem exists when a certain rule is very easy to circumvent and anyone can do it trivially without too much technical knowledge. However, in some ways, I don't like the way that this question is phrased. Does removing hand histories entirely solve the problem? Well, what's the problem? There is no actual problem, because if the problem is HUDs, HUDs aren't a problem. So there's no real problem here. When you focus on it, what is the real problem? The real problem is that the poker room is concerned that players having HUDs increases their skill edge too much, which then damages the ecology of the poker room, which hinders traffic, which ultimately undermines the bottom line in terms of revenue the poker room is taking. So the problem is not our problem. The problem is purely the poker room's problem. From the player's perspective, there's not really a problem here, because there's nothing wrong with HUDs and a lot of poker players want HUDs. But now we're left with some other issue once hand histories have been removed, where players can't track their results anymore. I would say that's fairly important, especially for a player who considers themselves a professional. We want to be able to track how much volume we've been playing and see a graph of our long-term results, for example. Example of a room that does this right now is Unibet, where there's no hand histories at all. Usernames are semi-anonymized because each player can have access to a number of different usernames. Admittedly, it's a very soft network, but unfortunately, it's not compatible with the ethos of many professional players because they want the ability to track results. Let's move on now to the next area, which is pre-flop charts. More and more players have access to pre-flop charts, including GTO solved pre-flop charts. And more poker rooms are creating a ruling that says you cannot use a pre-flop chart while you're actually playing at the tables. So a couple of things to think about here. Firstly, is using charts unethical? Once again, you're totally entitled to your own opinion here, and it's going to be valid. Personally, I don't think using pre-flop charts is unethical. It's a tool that requires skill to use accurately. This is why I also laugh when I see that poker rooms ban certain software. For example, Poker Stove. And if you're not familiar with the name Poker Stove, it's probably because it's such an old piece of software now. Poker Stove was the original Hold'em equity calculator, where we could put in 2 ranges and see how much equity we have. That's on PokerStar's banned software list. You cannot use Poker Stove at the same time as you play on PokerStars. And I'm thinking, how exactly does someone use Poker Stove to cheat and gain an unfair advantage playing online poker? I can't even imagine how a player begins to do that. I would say if someone is crushing high stakes poker at 15 big blinds per 100 hands because they're using Poker Stove at the same time as playing, I would say good for them. More power to them. This is clearly a very talented individual if they can use a raw equity calculator to generate such a large edge. It's almost ridiculous when you think about it. And it's the same feeling I have with preflop charts. They're actually way harder to use than you might imagine. It's not simply a case of following a set strategy, because there are so many different available sizings that could be used preflop. Typical player might have defending ranges against one sizing, but as soon as their opponent changes the open size, all of a sudden the player is a little bit in the dark because their preflop chart doesn't even cover that situation. Not to mention preflop charts don't take into account opponent profile or game dynamics or anything like that. So I'd say if a player is managing to generate a huge edge by virtue of the fact that they're using a preflop starting hands chart, I would say this is a player who's going to succeed no matter what. This is clearly a very talented individual if a preflop chart is boosting their win rate by that much. Besides, once again we have the same elephant in the room. Is banning of preflop grids enforceable? And unfortunately, the answer is no. This is not even close to being enforceable. Poker rooms do ban certain types of software that show preflop grids, but the thing is, it's so easy to view a preflop grid in a different format. Really simple example, I could simply load up my preflop grid on a different computer. I could have a laptop beside the side of my grinding station, which loads up the preflop grid. The main computer, the poker client process, would have no idea that I'm running something on a different system. We can even beat these types of rules using very low-tech approaches. I could even have my preflop grids printed off and stuck on the wall above my desk. Many poker players do this, by the way. They have complete preflop charts stuck to the wall by their grinding station. The point is, it's impossible to enforce this. And as we've mentioned, how much of an edge do preflop grids even really give? So what's the solution here? The logical solution is don't ban stuff that doesn't make sense to ban. Just allow all players to use preflop grids if they want to. We've leveled the playing field because this particular ruling is not even close to being enforceable anyway. Again, this is just my 2 cents. You might have a completely different viewpoint, and your viewpoint is 100% valid here. Moving on now to the next area, which is bum hunting. So poker room stance is that you can't stalk other players. In fact, some poker rooms have a system in place where if you join a ring game, you cannot leave that ring game until you've played at least 10 or 15 hands. If you're constantly joining a ring game and then leaving in the first few hands, that counts as bum hunting now as well. Is it unethical? Again, I would say no. I would say this is just good business, good table selection. That's what we encourage poker players to do. If you sit down in an environment, it doesn't look profitable, move to an environment that does look profitable, right? That's called table selection. It's not unethical. Besides, we also have this problem, which is, where do you draw the line between table selection and bum hunting? Obviously a poker room can't come out there and say, you are not allowed to table select. You must play at whichever table we tell you. Although actually, some rooms do kind of funnel you to a specific table and don't really give you too much choice. But no poker room, at least no self-respecting poker room, would say, we don't allow table selection. But they will say, we don't allow bum hunting. What's the difference? Where is the line between table selection and bum hunting? It's very, very difficult to pinpoint where that line is. And because of the blurriness of that line, preventing bum hunting, it's fairly difficult to enforce. I don't want to say it's not enforceable, because players get into trouble for bum hunting all of the time based on a specific algorithm the security team is using. But is prevention of bum hunting enforced in a fair way? I would say that's virtually impossible, because there are so many different ways of approaching table selection. Some slightly more aggressive techniques are obviously going to fly below the radar of the security team, while some slightly less aggressive approaches are going to get flagged by the security team, and the player is going to end up with punishments as a result. So it seems like it's not something that can be enforced fairly. Once again, are the poker rooms doing this because they want to protect you, the player? And the answer is no, not directly. You probably realize on some level that the poker room does not care if you lose your entire bankroll. They're doing this purely to protect the poker ecology, and in the long run, the objective is to protect their revenue. If the side effect of that is that weaker players lose their bankrolls faster, then it's just that. It's just a side effect or a secondary effect. They're not doing it directly to protect players from losing their money. So ironically, you could raise the allegation that this is in some ways unethical behavior on the part of the poker room. They're dressing it up in a certain way, saying they're doing it to protect you from predatory behavior, but they're not. They're doing it to protect their revenue. And you as a professional poker player now have limited options in terms of the way that you table select. In other words, you're giving up some of your revenue to protect the poker room's revenue. Is that ethical? I don't want to say it's necessarily not. At the end of the day, it's the poker room that's running the business and they have to make money. But it's still an interesting question. Okay, let's consider one final area, which is that of ghosting. And once again, the reason why ghosting is a little bit of a gray area is because it's very hard to know where exactly to draw the line. Now, what is ghosting, first of all? Ghosting is where you have another player railing you. Now, that could be in your physical environment, or it could be over Zoom or TeamViewer. And it's called ghosting if they are controlling the action somehow. So it could be that they are telling you what to do, or in some cases, it could be that they are actually making decisions on your behalf. They might have taken control of your mouse and keyboard with your permission. But the point is, it's not you that's really playing. It might be your avatar and your screen name, but you're acting heavily on advice from another player, or that player is making decisions on your behalf. Now, this is something that's always been against the terms and conditions of pretty much every poker room. We can still ask the question, is it unethical? And I suppose in the case of full ghosting, where another player is basically acting on behalf of another player, then we could, or most of us might say that it's unethical. Having said that, it really depends on the level and nature of the advice that's being given by the person who is ghosting. So the obvious question is, when does railing become ghosting? So railing is the poker term that basically just refers to watching another player play poker. So for example, I could connect to your screen via Zoom and I could just watch you play. That's referred to as railing. What happens if we kind of talk about poker at the same time, but I'm not influencing your decisions? Is that still railing, or is it ghosting? What if some of the things that we talk about actually then crop up in the very next hand? I've just given you advice previously, and as a direct result of the conversation we've had, you now make a different decision in the next hand compared to the decision you would have made. Is that now ghosting or is it still railing? What if we're actually talking about the hands as we play them, but I'm not directly telling you what you should be doing in each hand? Is that still railing or is it ghosting? What happens if I don't tell you what to do, I don't control your mouse, I let you fully make the decisions, but at each point you ask me, what would you do in this spot? And I tell you exactly what I would do in that situation. And you have free will, you have the ability to say, okay, I'm going to do that or I'm not going to do that. But let's just say 9 times out of 10, you actually follow the advice that I give. Is that still railing or is it ghosting? You can see the problem we have. Where exactly along that chain do we draw the line? There's obviously a little bit of a spectrum there between railing and full ghosting. Because railing is something that poker players have done since the beginning. Not just friends railing each other, but even a coach-student relationship. It's common for coaches to rail their student playing live online poker. And at what point does that cross the line from railing into ghosting? The other problem we have here is that prevention of ghosting is just completely unenforceable again. Now, poker rooms have taken some countermeasures. You'll notice that you can't run something like a Zoom client or a TeamViewer client at the same time as playing online poker on certain rooms. Having said that, there's absolutely nothing to stop a player physically sitting in your environment or using some kind of out-of-band channel, like telephone, for example. Now, we're not saying that ghosting is okay. I think most of us would agree that ghosting is unethical, especially when it approaches the point where everyone would agree that it's ghosting. But also, it's important to recognize that poker rooms have no ability to really enforce whether ghosting is taking place. And although it's okay for them to include it in their terms and conditions, I don't think it's something they should even begin to try and enforce. And it's just something that we have to accept may be taking place. You know, another issue with this is, when does ghosting become multi-accounting? I mean, if I'm connecting to your screen and making all of your decisions, I'm basically now just playing on your account. I might be proxying my decisions through you, perhaps if you are the one clicking the buttons, but this ghosting has now turned into multi-accounting. This is generally considered a bigger problem in high-stakes circles where, let's just say I'm a target of a high-stakes player. He wants to play against me because he knows I have certain weaknesses, and I don't necessarily know I have those weaknesses, and this particular high-stakes pro thinks he can take a lot of money from me. So we start playing online, but I'm not really the one playing. I'm connected to someone via Zoom or via telephone or someone in the same room as me, and he's actually the one making all of the decisions. Now this high-stakes pro thinks he's playing against me because it's my avatar, it's my screen name, but he's not really playing against me. He's actually playing against the person who's making all of the decisions. And this is generally considered very unethical, especially in high-stakes circles, because all of the exploits this high-stakes pro is bringing to the table, well, they're not going to work because he's not playing against the person he thinks he's playing against. It's almost like it's a form of identity hijacking. Problem is, there's absolutely nothing that poker rooms can really do to protect against this. All right, so we've considered 5 areas there. And I don't think these are talked about very often, so I don't think you'll find like forum posts dealing with these gray areas or anything. And that's why, as a result, many players have questions. Common question, for example, is simply, is data mining actually legal? And as you've hopefully picked up from this particular podcast episode, it depends a little bit on the context, it depends on the poker room, it depends on your own personal code of ethics. That's what a gray area is. There's not a black and white answer to the areas that we've discussed in today's podcast episode. So with that, we're going to wrap things up. Thanks very much for listening, guys. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.